I'm really pleased to say we've got Silvia Federici here today, who's on a book tour at the moment, promoting her book Revolution at Point Zero. I'm just going to say a few things about how we know Silvia and the kind of impact she had on Bristol Radical History Group, who organised this meeting. Just to say something very briefly, I think we're meant to say at the start of every meeting, isn't that right? If there's a fire, there is only one way out of this place, and it's the way you came in, so leave in an orderly manner. Steve in the corner there is a health and safety expert. He will assist you. He will assist you if there is a fire by probably running away screaming. So and the toilet's through there if you want to go to the toilet. And I don't know, have I got to say anything else? Right, this, yeah? No?
If anyone wants to bring any more drinks, do it now.
Yeah, so if you want a drink, get it now while I'm talking. Right, yeah, just a couple of things to talk about how we know Silvia. First of all, Bristol Radical History Group organised this meeting. We were formed in 2005, and certainly some of the writings that by Silvia and some members of the group she's been involved in, called Midnight Notes, so I'll talk about in a minute, had a big influence on us. Well, actually over the last 30 years, because some of us were reading Midnight Notes stuff in the 1980s. So it's a long history, and really Silvia's book, I think, kind of covers 40 years of politics and activism, both in Europe, the United States, and in Africa. So there's a lot of, I think, quite a bit of diversity in the book over that period. But just to say, Silvia came to Bristol in 2007 because we were doing some events that were called Witches, Pirates and Smugglers. One of our first set of events that Radical History did as a Radical History Week. And this book here was kind of really influential on that, this book Taliban and the Witch, which is Silvia's book on the women, the body and primitive accumulation. It was important to us because it was trying to get, I would argue, beyond the sort of fairly crude feminist analysis of the repression of women in the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries, because it was looking a bit beyond the idea of merely patriarchy being the driving force or some kind of irrationalism of the church. It was looking much more at the changes that were occurring in the peasant economies at the time. So about social engineering, about the idea of increasing the population of peasants, about taking control effectively locally, but also on the state level of reproduction, contraception and other things and medicine that women were involved in. So it was trying to looking a little bit further than the idea of irrationalism or crazy religious practice leading to the witch trials. So it made a big impression on us because it was trying to look a little bit wider than perhaps a narrower feminist approach which had happened previous to that. So that book had been influenced. Silvia came and spoke, I mean, it's good to see a lot of people here tonight. Certainly a lot of people turned up when we were doing the stuff in 2007. But also I want to talk very briefly about Silvia's connections to Bristol, because I know you were here in the 70s quite a lot, and that's mainly because Silvia helped found the group which eventually led to Wages for Housework, which was very strong in Bristol, and its part of its publishing arm was Falling Wall Press, which I think was probably situated or around Stokes Croft at the time. So there is a connection here. The Wages for Housework group were quite strong in the 70s in Bristol, and certainly if you read a lot of their text, you'll see Bristol coming up quite a lot in terms of its publications, stuff like that. I know there's certain people here who are kind of around at the time as well. Probably correct me on what I'm saying. The second thing is to talk about Midnight Notes, which had a Midnight Notes collective started publishing in around 1979, yeah. And the first book I read was a thing called Strange Victories, which was an analysis of the anti-nuclear movement, but from a class and anti-capitalist perspective rather than purely being stuck within the kind of the green politics of the time. So Midnight Notes have been quite prolific in producing stuff, particularly in the last 20 years around the idea of the commons. So other writers such as George Kvensis will be speaking next week, and Peter Linebaugh are involved in that, who've spoken in Bristol before. So I'll direct you towards Midnight Notes' work. Very interesting and very relevant, I think, certainly over the last 20 or 30 years. And lastly, when Silvia came in 2007, I've got to say, my mum and my mum's partner said, "Oh, we'll come down and we'll look after Silvia." And I was like, that's great, because I was very busy, but I used to come back after doing meetings for the Radical History Week, get back about midnight and be absolutely shattered. I'd be going to bed and they would be staying up talking about Africa all night, so that went on for days. So now Silvia's quite a good mates with Mum, which is quite nice. So we have a sort of little bit of a family connection now. But and the other thing to say is I think you've just done 3 meetings in London, which I've heard over 200 people turned up for. So that's nearly 700, 800 people who've turned up to see these meetings in London. Certainly it appears that this work, which I would argue many academics kind of push to one side or not interested in now, is highly relevant. And it's highly relevant, I think, since the crisis of 2008, to turn the spotlight back onto how capitalism and class affects us in our everyday lives, and particularly at this point 0, which is the point at which women take on unwaged work, the question of reproduction and the question of post-feminism, whatever that means. So it'd be nice to have a discussion about that afterwards, but I think it's highly relevant, and I'm just going to shut up and hand you over to you.
So maybe I'll find a way of parking myself that can liberate a chair, because I hate to see so many people standing, so maybe there's another one here. And I'll try to do this. A little housework one. That's a good introduction. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you to you all, and thank you to Roger for having invited me here, and thank you to the people who are running this beautiful bookshop for having me here. And I want to say something about, add to what Roger has said about Bristol. Yeah, I used to come here in 1975, and in fact it's weird that I find myself here tonight, because 2 of the articles, the first 2 articles in this book, were first published by Falling World Press here in Bristol in 1975. So actually the beginning of this book saw the light here, at least in a public form in Bristol. I want to say a couple of words first about the title of this book, Revolution at Point Zero, because I took the title from the book of a Egyptian feminist novel writer, Nawal al-Saadawi, that you probably know of. If you don't, then you should certainly make sure that you become familiar with her work. Her book was Woman at Point Zero, and it's a very powerful book. It made a big impression on me. I read the book many, many times. I used it in my classes. I donated it to my friends, and it's the classical book that I always say, if you pick it up, you cannot put it down. And I was always right. In that book, she described the situation of a woman who is basically waiting to be hanged because she killed the pimp, the man who was exploiting her. And Point Zero in that novel indicates the moment in which all illusions are gone. In fact, in the book, it represents the realization that there is no justice in this world. There cannot be any justice in this world for women, at least in the world in which the protagonist lived. There couldn't be any justice for her. At the same time, the Point Zero is also the moment of realization, of consciousness rising, of becoming aware that in fact this present state of being has to be radically changed, that there has to be a transformation, a revolutionary transformation. So this is the reason why I decided to choose this title for the collection of articles in this volume, which go from 1975, from the early 70s, to the late 90s and beyond. Actually, some of the last articles were written in 2010, 2011. So in this sense, for me, reproduction, which is the fundamental theme of this work, is the point zero. And it's the point zero for us in many ways, because it is, to speak of it as point zero is to refer to the incredible crisis that we are experiencing across the world on the question of reproduction. The fact that so many people now are living in a situation in which their life is continuously at stake, in which the ability to reproduce themselves is continuously in danger. And at the same time, it's point zero because precisely from the point of view of reproduction, precisely on the terrain of reproduction, we can begin to rebuild our life. I think there's a growing awareness, and I will speak a bit at the end of my talk also about the Occupy movement that has been growing in the United States. I think there's a growing awareness that if we want to transform society, if we want to change the world, we really have to start from our day-to-day reproduction. And I will elaborate on that point in the course of my talk. So obviously, from what I said, the concept of reproduction that I use is way beyond the traditional, the more common use of this term, which refers to biological reproduction, refers to procreation. Obviously, I use reproduction in a very broad sense. And in fact, in the course of the book, the idea of reproduction continuously changes. In the first part, reproduction makes reference in particular to domestic labor and to the reproductive work that women do in the war, that women traditionally in capitalist society have done in the home. But as the book develops, the concept of reproduction expands to include many, many forms of reproduction of labor power, reproduction of life, including, for instance, farming, production of food, including education, including the care for the environment. So the concept of reproduction is obviously much wider than the concept of domestic labor. But in a way, much of the framework that sustained the book, developed out of a reflection and also out of a struggle around the question of domestic work. And this is where I want to begin to introduce some of the main themes, in this volume. In the preface that I wrote and the introduction that I wrote, I reflect on the irony that sustains, that has the irony that has been involved in my becoming interested in the question of reproduction, because in many ways I was motivated to learn more, to discuss this issue, and of course to become involved in the women's movement, out of a profound refusal of housework, a profound refusal of the idea of a life, destined, to the classical, activities that, in my time certainly were expected of a woman. Becoming married, having children, taking care of the home, and possibly do something else, but fundamentally, become a good housewife. And like many women of my generation, this to us, as I wrote in one of the pieces in this work, seemed a destiny worse than death. And I often look at the women's movement as a mass revolt against housework. And of course, I want to explain in what sense we were in rebellion against housework, which I think was a common theme for many women of my generation. In the United States, it is often said that the great revolt against housework that motivated women in the 60s was an outcome of the experience of the war, of the fact that during the war so many women found themselves recruited into wage labor, and in particular into the kind of wage labor which had been traditionally male work. For example, the army industry, and I'm sure the same was true also, I know the same was true also in England. And with that recruitment came a whole experience of independence, and also came an experience of cooperative work, and particularly cooperation with other women, that carried over the end of the war, and made it very difficult for many women to readjust to a life of housewifery. And that experience of independence, they communicated then to their daughter, and the daughter again were raised to expect something different. That was certainly true also for women of my generation who grew up in Italy, but in our case I think there was also something perhaps different, or perhaps something more, which had to do with the profound experience that the devastation that the war caused in our country produced on us. I grew up, for example, with many tales of the times when we'll be bombed, when my mother had to run in the middle of the night underneath the bomb with 2 children. And I think that those stories and that experience, which was a mass experience, certainly disincentivizes us from the idea of, disintensifies us from the idea of dedicating our life to raising a family, having children that possibly will be taken over by the state, sent to war, sent to be butchered. And I write in some of the first pages of this book that this experience made it very difficult for us, to have sort of reformist approach to the question of housework and to the question of our lives. That the war represented a kind of a breakdown of a social contract between women and the state. The kind of contract that says if you perform in a certain way, then you have certain guarantees in your life. So it's not an accident that I was very interested and immediately attracted to the women's movement. When the women's movement began, precisely because the women's movement began questioning the role of women, in society, and began, in fact, questioning the whole role, the place that domestic activities have played in the oppression of women, what we used to call the oppression of women, still call the oppression of women. But of course, at the same time, there were many different positions on this matter. For those of you who have followed the debates that took place in the women's movement in the 70s, you realize there was a broad spectrum of answers as to why women, after all, were subordinate to men, and what particular function housework, domestic labor played in this subordination. I was part of an organization, as you know, the Wages for Household movement. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this movement. Certainly here in Bristol, as Roger mentioned, there was a very strong group. In 1972, in the summer of 1972, we launched a collective called the International Feminist Collective that gathered women coming from different countries, from England, from Italy, from the United States. There were also women from France. And out of a meeting that took place in Padua in July 72, we coming from different experience, we launched basically what we call the International Campaign for Wages for Housework. And that campaign which was not very successful in the women's movement. In fact, we were very the butt of many criticisms. That campaign came out of a particular type of analysis of the position of women in capitalism, of the question of domestic labor, and a good part, this book is divided in 3 parts. And the first part of this book, the articles that are in the first part of this book, in a way, some are really from the 70s, some from the 80s, but the articles that are in the first part of the book, in a way, explain the perspective that animated the campaign for wages for housework, the international campaign for wages for housework. A perspective that basically turned the table around with respect to the traditional Marxist understanding, socialist Marxist and socialist understanding of the roots of women's subordination to men in capitalism. You know, as you probably know, particularly in Engels' work, and also in Marx, although Marx's comments are much more scattered through his work, you have the theory that fundamentally women have been in a subordinate position because insofar as they've been confined to domestic activities, they have been excluded from socially necessary labor. In other words, from labor that capitalism recognizes has been productive of wealth, of accumulation, of capital, and therefore women do not even benefit of the kind of social power, limited as it may be, that is involved in the wage relation, which represents a certain type of social contract. Wages for housework, and I'm going to be more rather quick on this matter, because I imagine that some of these ideas are not really new. But wages for housework took actually very, very the opposite position. In fact, our argument was that far from being non-socially necessary labor, actually housework was the most important work in society, insofar as this work produces the worker. In other words, we define domestic labor. We said what we call housework, what we call domestic activity, are actually activities that produce the workforce, that produce labor power. In the sense, they are the pillar of society. They are the pillar of the capitalist organization of work, and the reason why this work, why women do not have the same social power as men, as other male proletarians, is not because their work is less important, but fundamentally because this work has been unwaged. And in a society where wage is synonymous with work, its wageless condition makes it completely invisible, makes it completely naturalized. It basically naturalizes this exploitation, and more important, the lack of a wage is the material foundation, for the whole hierarchy, for the labor hierarchy, that has been extremely effective in separating women of men and giving men power over women. Now, that analysis it was extremely important for us, and I think for the movement as a whole, even though in the movement there was a great hostility to the political translation of it, which was the demand for wages for housework, or the struggle for wages for housework. But it was extremely important because, in a way, it kind of unlocked, or let's put it this way, answered many secrets, basically answered many questions relating to the position of women. It clarified many, many issues that that clarification had important political implication. It clarified them in a way that had a important political relevance. For example, starting from that viewpoint, it became possible to see that many of the relationships that have normally been seen as family relationships or personal relationship between women and men, gender relationships, were actually relationship of production. They were actually relationships that production, as much as the relationship that sustained and surrounded the production of commodities for the market. Although the production was of a different type, it was a production of labor rather than a production of cars, chairs, and tables. But certainly, for example, sexual relations, we began to look at them as relations of production, right? And in one of the first articles that I wrote, Wages Against Housework, I began saying, they say it's love, we say it's unpaid labor. They call it frigidity, we call it absenteeism. Right? Every miscarriage is a work accident, etc., etc., etc. So it really began to break down the kind of isolation in which, and the suffocating atmosphere in which housework has always been analyzed. And begin to see, in fact, to place this work within a whole pattern of work relation, within a whole context of the broader capitalist organization of work. It also made possible to really see the wage in a very different way, to understand the wage relation, not only the wage, but the importance of thinking in terms of the wage relation more than the wage itself, because when you speak of a wage, you always tend to think and speak of it as if it were a thing, as if it were something somewhat self-enclosed, a certain amount of money, the payment for a certain task of labor performed. Whereas we began to see that the wage or the wage relation was a way to actually organize the society, that the wage was actually a particular form of social organization, and that as important part of the wage relation, the importance of speaking of the wage relation rather than the wage was because very much part of that relation was also the differential between wage and unwage labor. Right? In other words, that in capitalism, as important as the wage has been, equally important has been the lack of it, because that differential has been precisely the material foundation for all the labor hierarchy and, of course, all the different type of plantations that capitalism has built throughout its history, has required, despite the fact that it presents itself, as a system based on paid labor. But perhaps most fundamental of all, right, we began to understand that something very fundamental, which is that capitalism is a system that structurally, necessarily, programmatically has to devalue life, has to devalue the work of reproducing human beings. And that the devaluation of domestic labor was part of a much broader aspect of capitalist society, which is the fact that capitalism has to devalue the activities that reproduce the worker, that reproduce the power, and therefore the activity that reproduce our life, because in order to contain the cost of labor, in order to make labor power a cheap commodity. And in that sense, capitalism in so many different forms, in all of its different phases, fundamentally has to devalue the work that we do in order to reproduce ourselves, which means it has to devalue our life. This realization was very important because in a way immediately it forces you it forces you to take an anti-capitalist stand. It forces you to see that no matter what kind of struggle you engage in, your horizon has to be an anti-capitalist horizon. That this system, in fact, is a system that has to be gone beyond, that we have to go beyond capitalism, because this system is structurally necessarily dedicated, committed to, for example, racism, sexism as indispensable props of a hierarchical division of labor, and a division of labor that devalues labor power. So in this sense, already by the late 70s, early 80s, we had traveled from an analysis of gender relations in capitalism, an analysis of domestic labor, the position of women in capitalist society, to something broader, which was a different understanding of capitalism itself. A very different understanding of capitalism itself, which also meant a different understanding of the wage relation, the wage struggle, and the class struggle as a whole. Because if it is true that capitalism necessarily has to devalue certain sector, the labor of certain sector of the world proletariat, in order to maintain, in order to reduce the cost of the wage worker, if that is the case, then of course, as I mentioned before, sexism, racism, etc., are structurally necessary. And this understanding was very important to open up a whole new relationship, not only to gender, but to capitalism itself. This is the framework. This framework that I did not develop myself. I developed cooperatively with other women. And there are some women who actually gave a very important contribution to the development of this idea, Maria Rosa Costa, Selma James, and others. And this idea came out not only out of our mind, this I want to stress very strongly, they came out also a whole process of struggle, because certainly the idea that unwaged labor is important in the process of capitalist accumulation and in the struggle against capitalism didn't come only from the women's movement, but it had been made, had been a pillar of the theories that had come out of the anti-colonial movement, also the Black Power movement in the United States. So I would say that the theories that we produce, and generally the feminist movement produced, also had many antecedents, which is important to recognize. In any case, this framework is the framework that by the late 70s, I used to basically try to understand or rethink, reread the history of capitalist development. And I will only say a few words about it, because tonight I want to speak about the themes of this volume. But certainly the work that I did in Caliban and the Witch, in a way, was an application of this perspective, of this understanding of the structural character, the most important structural relations in capitalist society, and apply that understanding to rethinking the history of capitalist society. Because I wanted to understand, when did it start? And what kind of historical development, created a society in which this work could be devalued. At the time I consider myself a Marxist, but I knew a bit of Marx, and I couldn't find in much of Marx really an answer to many of the questions that I had, including the famous chapter about primitive accumulation, in which Marx confronts the issue of the rise of capitalist relations. So that framework helped me to basically reconsider the fact that the rise of capitalism is quite different from what Marx has proposed. That Marx only sees one important development, which is the separation of the peasantry from the land, the process of enclosure, which for Marx begins here in England with the enclosure of the communal land that people had and cultivated in common, and the expulsion of the peasant population and so forth. And it became very clear that Marx had a very limited conception of the historical processes that had been fundamental to the foundation of capitalist society. that together with the expulsion of the peasantry from the land, together with the conquest, colonization of the Americas, there had been also a whole attack, a whole war on women that has gone under the name of the witch hunt of the 16th, 17th century, and this in fact is what is the topic of this volume, Women, the Body of Primitive Accumulation. I was led to reread the witch hunts and to realize certain very, very basic phenomena. First of all, the chronological coincidence of the beginning of the slave trade, the colonization of the Americas, the expulsion of the peasantry from the land, together with throughout the Europe that was beginning to move in a capitalist direction, the fact that you have this massive, massive persecution of women accused of being witches and persecuted and executed for crimes, that I in my view, we soon clearly I discovered were crimes that basically had to do with practices, activities that contrasted to the need of the developing capitalist discipline of labor. And crimes relating, for example, to procreation, crimes relating to sexuality, because the rise of capitalism capitalism needed to appropriate the female body in a context in which the female body begins to be seen as basically an instrument for the production of workers, and in a context in which female sexuality begins to be seen as an obstacle to the imposition of a certain discipline of labor. So this is the work that I did in Caliban and the Witch, but what instead I would like to speak about tonight is something closer to our time, which is the type of primitive accumulation that has been taking place since at least the early 80s in response precisely to the cycle of struggle that I was referring to before, the anti-colonial struggle, feminist struggle, blue-collar struggle that culminated in the 60s and 70s. And by the early 80s, as you know, we begin to have a process of global restructuring of the global economy, what we call globalization, that in many ways represent, a contemporary repulse of certain aspects of primitive accumulation. Except that now, primitive accumulation has become almost a permanent process. Right? We have an ongoing process of primitive accumulation. In the second part of this volume, I look at these developments, right? And I want to say a number of things here in relation to them. To give you some of the titles that I speak of Women, the New International Division of Labor, Reproductive Work, that takes place with the entrance of women in the US and Europe into the wage workforce, and at the same time the more commercialization of certain aspects of housework. I speak of war, the role that war has played, the increasing presence of war, in the restructuring of social relations and the restructuring of reproduction. And I speak about what happens to the reproduction of labor power in the global economy. Throughout these works, there is a number of points that I think are important. I can only sketch them. But I would say, first of all, that the frame that I described before, right? First of all, one, taking reproduction as central, as a kind of central window from which to look at capitalism, from which to look at the global economy. Two, to keep in mind the structural necessity of capital to continuously devalue, reproductive work, the activities that sustain reproduction as a kind of indispensable condition of accumulation, right? And connected with that, the equally structural need that capitalism has had to constantly create population without rights, right? Or population that are in a sense in a subordinate position, whose exploitation is naturalized and ideologically justified as pertaining to something of their personality or their psychological or social makeup, right? This characteristic, keeping this characteristic in mind and in looking at the transformation taking place in the global economy was extremely useful. And I propose that it enabled me to see and to challenge some of the mystification that, in my view, have accompanied, that have characterized, some of the explanation about what globalization is about, right? For instance, there's often been stated that the essence of the new economy, the new world economy that has developed in the 90s and so on through globalization, has been this incredible technological leap, right? So often there's been a whole trend in radical literature that has portrayed, right, the essence, the most important aspect of globalization as being this technological innovation through the computerization of work, and also this transformation in the nature of accumulation. For example, like Negri and Hart, they speak of the rise of cognitive capitalism. More mainstream economies have spoken about the rise of the knowledge society. Right? So these are some of the images through which the globalization process has been understood. In other cases, the accent has been placed on the fact that industry has been relocated worldwide, that industrial production has been deterritorialized. In other words, that now industrial production can continuously move from place to place and doesn't have to, it's not any longer rooted in particular areas. Also the precarization of work. Now, I do not want to suggest that these aspects, this transformation are not important. They do not reveal something significant of these the new forms of organization of work and accumulation that have taken place. But I want to suggest that in a way they do not go to the core of what globalization has been and is, and in particular what has enabled the capitalist class to regain the initiative, to be able to shift the power relation with respect to the power relation that had prevailed by the 60s and early 70s, precisely as a result of that incredible coming together of struggles that almost in a way constituted an almost revolutionary situation. I would say that if you look at the structure of the global economy from the point of view of reproduction, the reproduction of labor power, you begin to see that in fact what has enabled the capitalist class to regain the initiative, to restart, reactivate the globalization, the accumulation process. I don't know if you remember, some of you are my age, and so you probably remember that by 1973, capitalism was in a very, very deep crisis. By 74, they were speaking of zero growth. By 75, 76, they were scrambling across the world to figure out how we are going to reorganize work. Because there was this idea that the crisis was so deep, and it was a crisis in class relation, that something had to be invented. Well, eventually something was invented, Locke was invented, and I would say that the essence of it was the capacity that capitalism has to launch a very massive attack on the fundamental conditions of our reproduction. They're far more important than the computer and the computerization of work or any other technological innovation. What is being fundamental in the creation of this new global economy has been the capacity that the capitalist class has had in different parts of the world to, in fact, undermine in very fundamental way the condition in which people reproduce themselves, the ability to reproduce themselves, and undermine their means of reproduction, whether it has been through war and therefore displacement of entire population times, or it has been through massive forms of land expropriation, through the process of structural adjustment, which has basically instituted a new form of colonization, has recolonized entire regions of the world, and breaking up those local economies by liberalizing the economies, allowing foreign products, etc., to come in, by imposing devastating austerity programs, etc., etc., etc. And of course, that process is not terminated. In fact, that process now, after having begun in Africa, after having begun in Latin America, creating forms of impoverishment, where in Latin America there were years in which women were buying milk by the glass, or they were buying eggs by the unit. Such was the level of impoverishment that developed. Now, of course, it's also coming to Europe. Greece, Italy, Spain are going through, in fact, this process of primitive accumulation and expropriation that I was referring to. So that, in fact, the issue of reproduction has been really fundamental also in the process of the reconstruction of the global economy in a capitalist sense. And on that attack on reproduction, in fact, everything else, in a sense, has depended. Right? For example, the restructuring of industry, the free export zones, the relocation of many, many aspects of industrial production, the massive expansion of informal labor. And I want to add here that to take the viewpoint, the framework that I was proposing, that I was describing before, has also been important for me, and I think more generally, to understand why within this restructuring it has been women who have been most directly targeted, and those who have in fact been suffered most of the consequences of the globalization of the world economy. And I would really like to take off my coat.
That's
because
fine.
now, could I take this off?
Yeah.
Okay, because it's now becoming so hot that I'm roasting. So what happens to this? But you can hear me when without. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much.
We'll put the
Yes, I'll
mic
put
up.
it here, yeah.
What do you want to do?
Okay, why women? So that it's become possible to see why women have been especially targeted, because women have been the primary subject, precisely of these reproductive activities that, in fact, through many different policies, capitalism has attacked, undermined, devastated, which is why thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of women throughout, starting with the early 90s, have left their home, particularly from Africa, from Latin America, the Caribbean islands, parts of Asia, and crossed the ocean, looking for ways to acquire an income, despite the fact that in doing so they would face years and years of isolation and years of separation from their family, and the whole set of hazards, beginning with the confrontation with the police authorities, immigration authorities, and so forth. Right? You cannot really explain this massive diaspora. Usually it's been men who have migrated. In the 90s we've seen, in fact, something very new, that the highest number of world migrants have actually been women. There's been actually an increase with respect to the number of men. Women have been the majority of the migrants, and they are those that in fact have been utilized by capital to restructure domestic labor in the very countries where the countries like Europe, like the United States, and where women at the same time, other women, were introduced massively into the wage workforce. So clearly together with the attack on the means of reproduction, we also have a massive restructuring of the reproduction of labor power. And this is one of the issues that I confront in the second part of this volume, to say that despite the fact that there's been a major change in the way in which reproductive work has been organized. For example, we have had this double trend. On one side, in Europe, Japan, United States, we have the mass entrance of many women in the wage workforce. At the same time, in other parts of the world, you have a population of women who are losing their jobs, forced to migrate, and this double trend creates a restructuring of the workforce that provides a very new scenario with respect to the one that we confronted in the 70s. But nevertheless, some of the key points of the perspective I was proposing, I think, are still very important for us to understand the main dynamics that are taking place in our time. Because even though much of the work that is being performed in industrialized societies, that in the home has been marketized, placed on a commercial basis, has been unloaded on the shoulders of many women coming from different countries. And even though in many industrialized countries you have a massive entrance of women into the wage workforce, and nevertheless the phenomena that I was referring before as central to understand the reproduction of labor power and to understand how capitalism accumulates in our time are still very important. Because despite these changes, what has not changed is that reproductive work has continued to be devalued. The devaluation of reproductive work, with all the hierarchies that have traditionally been built on this devaluation, have not really been seriously challenged. And here, throughout some of this work, throughout some of these articles, I'm very critical of the strategies that were adopted by the women's movement, certainly in the United States, but I could say also in Europe, with regard to reproduction in the late 70s and 80s. Strategies that basically equated emancipation, equated the path to liberation with the acquisition of a job for the wage, under the assumption that going to work out of the home for the wage meant that housework too, would leave the home. In fact, often this is how it is characterized, right? We say women have left the home, housework have left the home, is now performed in a socialized basis outside of the house, or it is performed on a pay basis by women hired employees. But in reality, when we look at the restructuring that is taking place, we actually see that in very fundamental ways, the kind of unequal power relations and the problems that were connected with the devaluation of housework have continued, except that they have been reproduced in a new way. Right? First of all, women continues to do the largest amount of unpaid reproductive work in the world. It is women who actually do most of the childcare work. All the statistics that I've seen relating not only to the US and so on, Australia, indicate that even when women do have a work outside of the home, they continue to do work unpaid labor. Why? Because not many can hire a domestic laborer, and because even though some of their work that is performed in the home can be marketized outside, much of it cannot be marketized, except the costs that will be prohibited. To add, in addition, that the fact that the women's movement has not really conducted a very strong mobilization on the question of reproduction in the 70s and 80s, and instead, in a way, concentrated its energies on acquiring better conditions on the wage labor market, on the work outside of the home. That because of that, in fact, the state has had the possibility to, in fact, disinvest even in those aspects of housework that in the past had been subsidized. An outstanding case for us in the US has been the case of maternity leave, where in the late 70s, when the issue of maternity leave came to the foreground, the women's movement did not really mobilize, because the assumption was that if we wanted to gain full equality with men in the labor market, then we could not ask for privileges such as maternity leave. Consequently, by 1976, the state, the issue went to the Supreme Court. And by 1976, basically the Supreme Court ruled that employers did not have to grant women maternity leave. In other words, you have to fight it case by case, which is in fact the situation now. So I want to make something clear, because I don't think that I was clear enough before, that as we have, with the process of globalization, a very strong attack on the means of reproduction. In other words, the whole sphere of reproductive activities across the world comes under fire. And in particular, those areas of activities, that have traditionally been women's activities. For example, many of the services that were catering to reproduction, have been cut by the state, as part of this assault on the means of our reproduction, right? As this process was underway, right, we also have another process, which is increasingly, certainly in the United States, but also in Europe, you have a women's movement that is increasingly concentrated on fighting on better condition, on comparable condition with men in the wage workforce. Ironically, at the time in which the wage workforce was also coming under attack. So that in fact the massive entrance of women in the wage workforce took place at a time in which the wage workforce was becoming a disaster area. Where the guarantees, where the type of benefits, entitlement, wage levels, organization of work, etc., that characterized those moments where workers had some power, in fact, were being undermined. So that in fact we have a situation in which not only women have not been emancipated through entrance in wage labor, which is what in fact our position was when we fought for wages for housework. Our argument was that unless you deal with the issue of reproduction first, and with the issue of the devaluation of reproductive labor first, as a fundamental condition for obtaining any gain on any other terrain, right? That position, in fact, is revealed, turned out to be true, turned out to be quite prophetic, because in reality, this is what has happened. So that we have had, in fact, a situation where women have gone to work outside the home for the pittance of a wage, and that continue, in fact, to perform much of their labor that they were performing to begin with. Let's clarify this point. There's been definitely a reduction of housework. They have reduced to have, instead of 3 children, now women. Many women do not have children. Many women live alone. Prefer not to have a family, prefer not to have a permanent partner, to have more independence. The fact that women, of course, have gained the wages meant that they have achieved a certain amount of independence from men. But nevertheless, when we look at the overall situation of reproductive work, we see that the fundamental structures have not changed. And I want to elaborate a little bit on that. For instance, much work has returned to the home. The fact that the home, reproductive work, and its devaluation has not been fundamentally challenged, right, has meant that the home has been a kind of a magnet for taking in unpaid labor. For instance, many women now do informal labor. In addition to taking care of their families, they also do textile work or electronic work at home. So that the existence still of this core of unpaid labor and the labor taken for granted in the home, and the fact that many women are trapped in that situation because they have children and they still at the same time need to have some money of their own, has also meant that companies have not only relocated industry all over the world, but they've almost transferred good amount of that work back into the home. So that now you have many women across the world, this is not only in the United States, but it's across the world, who in addition to performing homework, housework, they're also performing industrial labor in their home, often recruiting also their children. Second, for example, the reorganization of the dismantling of the welfare state and the reorganization of healthcare. And here I'm speaking mostly with the example coming from the US, but I assume, particularly after reading the latest stories coming from Greece or Spain, the reorganization of healthcare, the welfare state, has meant that, and the cuts that have been performed, has meant that a lot of their work, is now being done in the home. For instance, in hospitals now, the stay for the person who has an operation, or a person who has clinical problems, is being so reduced that the family members, most often women, female members, have to pick up, the kind of work that used to be done by nurses. in a clinical setting. You know, basically you return from the hospital after an operation, very few days, as soon as you can be transported. And now, as a wife or a mother, you are expected to, you know, insert a catheter. You are expected to do all kinds of things, services that traditionally a nurse may have done. I don't know if it is the same situation in England. Probably the healthcare system here works better. I know it's true in the United States. No, it's not better. Right? So that in fact all that work, right? So as the services are being cut, for example, a lot of the United States used to have services, aids to elderly people, non-self-sufficient or semi-sufficient. You know, those who do not want to live move to a nursing home, and nevertheless, they with some help, need some help. With some help, they can still stay in their home and not be institutionalized. And so there used to be services like aids, going to provide some hot meals, going to provide some medical care, etc. Those now have been decimated, are being decimated, depending on the state. But all the states, these are the ones that are chopping. All their work now is now reabsorbed by the home, and is reabsorbed usually, not exclusively. In fact, children are now taking on even medical operation. You know, there are many stories of children giving injection. I speak of them. I have an article on elder care, and in doing research around that theme, I discovered, for example, in New York and in the United States, you have many children who, because maybe there's not an adult parent in the home, there's an elder relative in the home, and they are the only ones who are more there at home because everybody else is out on a job. And they are learning to give injection to their grandmother and grandfather. This is taking place now. So there's a lot of work that has come back to the home, right? And the most outstanding demonstration, that the devaluation of reproductive work, which has not really been addressed by the women's movement, still has a profound impact on women's life, has been the condition of domestic workers. I mentioned before that there's been a direct connection between the globalization of poverty, if you want, through the structural adjustment program, through the policies of recolonization of much of the third world, and the migration of women across the world, the diaspora of women who become nurses, who become maids, who become sex workers, and this has been part of the restructuring of reproductive work. While the condition of migrant women who become domestic workers, I think, is exemplary precisely of that devaluation of housework. You know, the fact that housework has continued, reproductive work has continued to be seen as non-work. To give an example, in the United States, over the last 2-3 years, one of the biggest battles over reproductive labor has been the battle of domestic workers, in particular this organization called Domestic Workers United, which is based in New York and in California, to be recognized as workers. Because only in November 2010, in New York State they have won, in California, GC, Governor Brown has refused to sign the bill. Only in 2010, domestic workers have been recognized as workers. Right? And this was their struggle. And their campaign was a campaign for the Bill of Rights. And the slogan was, "Up from slavery." I don't think there could be a more outstanding demonstration about, you know, what I'm describing. The fact that despite the great changes that have taken place in the organization of reproductive work, that much has been marketized, commercialized, placed on a paid basis, that in reality, the fundamentals of it, the nature of the relationship that characterize their work have not fundamentally changed from the type of relationship that we confronted when we were campaigning for wages for housework. So that obviously it would be foolish not to recognize the differences, but it's to prove that unless we have the kind of movement, unless we have the type of social movement that begins to deal in a serious way with the question of reproduction, we cannot make any fundamental gain on any other terrain. Now, I want to move towards a conclusion. And I do that by making a few comments about the third part of the book. In the second part of the book, I describe, most of the article really describe what is the reorganization of reproductive work in the global economy, on the macro level as well as the micro, so to speak, specifically relating to the situation of women. In the last part, I look instead at the question of what I call the politics of the commons. And the connection is that the issue of the common, in my view, and why there's been so much interest, and including my interest, in the question of the commons in recent years, has been directly related to the type of reproduction crisis that we have witnessed and that I was referring to, right? That I think as more and more people have come to recognize, right, that we are in a phase of capitalism, where the capitalist class is very much determined not to allow us to have any access to the wealth of the world, without a tremendous amount of exploitation. Without a tremendous amount of exploitation, where now less and less people have access to land, to forest, to waters, even to the sidewalks. In the United States, there are struggles now for the right to sit in a sidewalk. In San Francisco and in Los Angeles, not to mention the attack that is taking place throughout the world on people vending in the streets, right? Which is a whole struggle in itself. So that we are being pushed away. We are being pushed away from the beaches. We are being pushed away from the sidewalks. We are being pushed away from the fields. There's a land grabbing taking place in Africa, which is tremendous. And I've not even talked about the attack on reproduction through ecological devastation, through the oil spills, through the devastation produced by aquapharma, aquaculture, etc., etc., etc. I mean, unfortunately, the time limit, right? But even just looking at the situation I described before, right, of the situation in which many of us live, of particularly when I speak many of us, I refer in particular to women who now have to juggle a wage job, have to juggle in the majority, the classical amount or great amount, or even if they have refused, of unpaid labor in the home, even if some of it has been commercialized, even if some of it is brought to the laundromat, even if some food is eaten in a cafeteria, but nevertheless there's still a tremendous amount, the particular expense when you have young children, or when somebody falls ill, when you have elderly relatives that are not self-sufficient. There are women who are sandwiched between a job, taking care of a child, and then taking care of some relative who is not self-sufficient. And what we have on a whole, and these are the reports that are continuously coming, what we have as a whole is a situation of women who are living on a state of constant crisis. And this is something that I try to illustrate in some of this material, living continuously on the edge of crisis. Crisis meaning that you have no life. You have no life. You're always running. You're always working. You have no time for yourself. You have no time for doing the things that, in a sense, will give a meaning to our life. and live continuously in a state of terror, because any slip that we make, in the States we say, you live with the impression that any slip you make, you'll be thrown under the bus. In fact, that expression is now becoming so common because it really reflects a kind of mass anxiety about how close you are to being destroyed. So close you are, that we now have a state, a capitalism that is basically feeling the power to basically deny any right that we have to being reproduced, and basically assert that we should be grateful, to even have the pittance of jobs and forms of survival that we have. So I think that because of this situation of crisis, which I say is a crisis of reproduction, the issue of the commons has become so important. It's become important internationally. In fact, some of the ideas and the struggle around the commons and the imaginary which is connected to it has really come precisely from the areas that have been struck most and first. Latin America, Africa, those places where forms of communal land property still survived, and but have come, globalization has basically targeted them, and I don't have time to mention some of the struggle, but I would say we have learned a lot, and I know people here have gone to Mexico, have learned from the Zapatistas, we have learned from the water wars in Bolivia, right? We have seen, and what we have learned there, I think, is that population that had possibly far less resources than us, have been able to confront all the powers that be, not only the state but the international state, the World Bank, the privatizing companies, and so forth. And at times, like in Bolivia, reverse privatization, because they still had a great amount of cohesiveness. They still had a kind of communal type of life, communal type of relationship that constituted a tremendous base, a social base, a power, a counterpower. And I think that the idea of the commons represents that, because in addition to the economic attack on our reproduction, there's also been the social attack. The fact that dismantling of factories, dismantling of community, the increase in the prices of rent, dismantling of services have also disintegrated our social fabric, have also broken down the forms of organization that people have had. And this is what has made us vulnerable. This is also what has undermined the capacity to challenge the state, to resist this type of attack. And I think the politics of the common reflect the idea that this is where we have to start all over again, in a way, that we have to start to rebuild those social bonds, those communal bonds, and create forms of activity and practices starting from our reproduction. They can begin to, reunite what the last 20, 30 years separated, and then we begin to reconstitute, reconstruct our social fabric. And I hope to make more examples when I like to make example in the discussion, because I really want to conclude now because I've been talking too long. And but I also want to say the one element of that something encouraging in recent time for us, is specifically in the US, has been the development of the Occupy movement, that I see as a movement that reflects the consciousness, and also reflects, despite many, many limits that it has, it reflects a new type of doing politics, right? A new type of doing politics, that is a doing politics that does not separate the moment of protest and challenge to the state, to the capitalist class, also from the moment of the rethinking and reconstituting of reproduction. so that when not only Wall Street, the area around Wall Street was occupied, because the occupation took place in at least 600 American cities, right? But through those occupations, what was important about was not only the fact that people began to make decisions, take decisions more democratically through forms of direct action and direct democracy, through the assemblies and so forth, but also they began to socialize in a different way and to begin to organize reproduction together, creating medical teams, cooking together, making contact with the farmers, for example, in upstate New York or in other parts of the area, to get food, not through the market, but in a way that would be outside of a market relation. Create teams that will clean up the place, and in that process, for many, many, many young people, that was very, very important transformative experience. Many people, in fact, after the encampments were broken down, have mourned for weeks because they missed powerfully that experience. Because in working together around the most immediate needs of reproduction, they also created bonds that were extremely important and are indispensable in the political struggle, where you want to know who are the people around you, whom you can trust, whom you can't trust. You want to, in a sense, put your life in common with the life of other people. Okay, I will stop here. I'm sorry for
Right, any questions?
Yeah.
Mike?
In the UK, what I think is a real issue is that it's almost like this: the state at the moment is just indoctrinating through the propaganda this idea that everybody should work, everybody should, like, if you don't work you're worthless, if you're sick, you should be forced back into work. And it's sort of seeping. I mean, only yesterday I had an argument with someone on Facebook about this, who I knew from years ago, and he's going on about how, he's totally bought into this idea, that everyone should work, everyone should, this whole concept. And what I find so utterly sickening is that the fact that they just attack vulnerable people for not working, and I think a lot of people buy into that, and it's really difficult to sort of talk to people to get them to change their view, who aren't, obviously at this sort of meeting. I'm talking about people who aren't engaging in sort of radical politics or left politics. And the propaganda machine just pumps out all the time. I mean, it's like this idea that Cameron, before they got into power, were just banging on and on about welfare cheats. Then they banged on about, families getting £26,000 a year in benefits, which is like 0.01%, and most of it goes on rent anyway to landlords in London. And I just don't know how that dialogue can be changed with, a mass level, to build this sort of, this sort of thing that you were talking about, because in other countries, I agree, I can see where if you've already got the cohesion. I mean, I'm from a very small town in Forest of Dean, and all areas of socialising, like local shops, miners' welfare halls, pubs, they're gone. People stay at home, they consume alcohol at home, they shop in supermarkets where they don't talk to each other really. So these areas where people can actually engage with each other are really limited. And I just wondered what sort of your thoughts are on that, because that to me is a really big...
I think it's a very general conditions, right? On two levels. One, is that those developments I was describing before have really shredded, so many communities. For example, I mean, in the US, one standard example, the industrial Northeast, where you had this, town upon town, Michigan, Flint, and so on, where people have really created very basic community that came out of decades of struggle. And with the industrialization of those areas, those communities totally shredded. So that's one process. And then you add gentrification, people being pushed out of the cities, right? So all of that. And then you also have under the use, right, trying to divide you, which is going on, for example, in Greece, like the Golden Dawn now, right? Basically saying, yeah, it's the immigrant. If there were no immigrants, everybody was fine because they are taking your jobs, right? Or one form or another, all these black kids that they don't want to work. We have exactly the same stories. We have exactly, and this in a way, it's really what has to be for us. This is the challenge, because the politics of the commons. You cannot have commons where you have this kind of division. So the first goal is to really address this division and to organize against these divisions, right? So I think in a way the way perhaps to respond, beside the classical ways, is also to begin to create, networks of reproduction that can respond or can address the fears that people have and the isolation in which people are, right? So that the question of now, there's been a proliferation of activities that I think comes from this desire to not be isolated. We have had the urban gardens, the time banks, now the Occupy movement, which has been very quite successful in terms of bringing a lot of people together, right? And I think beginning from the question of reproduction, I think that these kind of activities that can begin to basically create structures in the community, right? So it's I imagine, I know that this may seem a very weak response to a very strong state of attack, but it's also a concrete way to begin to deal and challenge the kind of isolation in which we live, right? And this can be all kinds of structures. And for example, in the US now, there's been activities of people, and I think that they're also here, dealing with the question of creating structures in the community that enable you not to resort to the police, particularly in many situations, dealing with persons who commit certain abuses. And now we call the police, etc., etc. What if we can create structures that can perhaps perform in the way some of the structures they have, for example, in Mexico or in Bolivia, indigenous people, where you have structures of accountability, where you create, the fact is now we don't have communities. We speak of communities, but in reality it's a fiction, right? People don't know each other, or they know very little about each other. But what if we begin to create those structures? So now there's been a number of people in New York, in California, who have begun to figure out how we bring different organizations working around issues like rent, or issues around health, etc., bringing them together so that they can begin to coordinate and cooperate with each other. And, for example, create some forms of accountability, so that if somebody, for example, beats up a woman or beats up a male partner, can actually be addressed by some of these organizations. As to give an example, domestic workers, the domestic workers I referred to before, they are in a very classical situation of isolation. Like they won a Bill of Rights in New York, and then the next question was, how do you make it implemented? How do you have, because you're one-to-one with an employer in the isolation of a home. So this is one of the most fundamental problems they face. They face a state that does not recognize them, and also they face a work situation which is extremely isolating. So they are actually now trying to work out a similar situation of commoning, right? Of basically figuring out how they can begin to create, structures again, organization in the community. They can act as a kind of watchdog or mediating partner between them and the employer. For example, a number of organizations who will know about domestic work and what is fair and what is not fair, so that if you are a domestic worker who has been abused, or if you are an employer that wants to know what is right to do, you can actually refer to this organization, so that you're not any longer alone, or you're not any longer dependent to a structure above your head. You're not any longer dependent on the state, right? So the idea, which is of course is not an easy idea, the idea is how we begin to, in a sense, reclaim, right? Begin to reclaim control of all set of activities and practices that have normally been deferred, to organizations that are completely above us, that we do not control, whether it is union, the state, and so forth, right? So the recognizing, for example, the dismantling of the welfare state, right? And I don't like the word welfare state. Recognizing the fact that we now have a phase of capitalism that has programmatically disinvested in our reproduction. This is the welfare, because the welfare state is too much of a benign word. Like the state was never interested in our welfare. They were always interested in more non-conflictual forms of relation, and they were forced to by struggle, right? That in a way beginning to reclaim, reclaim control on some of those activities, and so above all creating at the community level, recreating community, producing community. This is a concept that now is circulating, the idea of producing community. Because even to begin to reclaim, what the state has in their hands, the kind of resources that they have, which they have taken from us, even to challenge the state, we need to have a base. We need to have some power, and that's what now we are lacking. So this question of beginning from reproduction is beginning to explore how we can cooperate in our day-to-day life, and how we can begin to build some of those bonds that the reorganization of the capitalist organization of work has torn apart. And where do we start, right? Of bringing people together. And so the Occupy movement and the in a sense, not to idealize the movement, but in a sense it expressed something, it expressed the need. We used to say in the women's movement, you cannot separate the personal from the political. Well, that's an example. You don't separate the political protest, from the moment of the reorganization of day-to-day life. First of all, because people have needs that are urgent. And unless you begin to talk right away, you can have a demonstration. But if you have a child at home who is sick, if you have a relative, etc., you have to take care of. If you're working all day and you're exhausted, then there is no way. So you dealing with the question of people's needs is now really a prerogative. It's extremely, extremely important, And second, it's really around the issue of reproduction that you begin to actually talk to each other, know each other, developing relationship, and also figuring out what we want in these neighborhoods. How do we deal with the trash? I know it's not to replace the state. I think it's very important not to play the big society, right? But to challenge the state but to build the power to then challenge the state. Because I think there's an important difference. Now, how do you embody the difference, right? How do you organize the difference? How do you make sure that those activities, do not replace the state, do not become the kind of band-aid that lets the state off the hook, but instead becomes something that, as I say, produces solidarity, produces bonding, produces a kind of counter-power in the community, right? That, of course, is something that has to be defined in the practice. I don't think it can be defined abstractly, right? But I think it comes, for me, it comes from the realization that within reproduction, there is always this aspect, you reproduce yourself for the market, you reproduce to become a loyal worker, you reproduce yourself for the struggle. And I think that we always know the difference, right? And that's the way reproduction has that double aspect, right? What are we reproducing ourselves for? For example, we set up a child care, right? Setting up a child care, that's one of the most immediate needs. Well, we can set up a child care in such a way that, we park our children for a few hours so that we can go to work, etc., etc. Or we can organize the child care in a way that we begin to collectively decide what kind of human beings, how do we produce in human beings, what kind of needs, what kind of issue, how do we need to re-educate ourselves so that we can educate our children, right? In Bolivia, I spent time in Bolivia with women from this organization called Mujeres Creando. And I don't know if any of you knows this group, a fantastic group in La Paz. They have a big house, and that house has many, many activities. They organize, it's really a mass organization. They have a legal aid, they have a guarderia for the children, they have a restaurant which produces very cheap food, and they are involved in a lot of struggle. And also cultural struggle. They really are very much interested in changing the imaginary, the collective imaginary about women. So they do this great graffiti work all over the city, etc., etc. And I talked about with those who are organizing the child care. And this is the kind of thinking, I was very, very impressed with that, because they said, we don't want child care just because, the mother has got to go to work, right? To another work, not to go to work, because childcare is work. But we want childcare. For us, childcare was a question really of the new generation, of the new society. The children is the new society. So we realized that if we wanted to do childcare well, we first had to have also meetings with the mothers, right? Because it's not a question of just keeping the child. It's a question is, what does this child need? And you cannot be alone as a child care worker. You have to decide it with the mother. And then the fathers. Then we realized also with the father. So we had discussions about sexuality with the mother, with the father, etc., etc. So this is how you deal with child care, right? This is some of the difference in the way reproduction can be organized, either for the labor market or for something different, right? And then also because we need to explore. I think it's very important exploring different ways of reproducing ourselves beyond the nuclear family. The nuclear family has already been destroyed in so many ways, right? It remains, but it's already been very, very but destroyed in a way that has not created an alternative. There are some alternatives, but now, for example, the need for more collective forms of reproduction, right, is something that when you do domestic work on a sustained basis, it is indispensable, so that nobody goes crazy. Like when there's certain type of work, particularly the reproducing human beings, that is so labor intensive, that the idea that one person or even two persons can actually do it in a satisfactory way, it's completely absurd. It's completely absurd. And in fact, there is a huge documentation that people who take care of elderly, people who take care of those who are sick, at the end of the day, are themselves sick, right? And that kind of work also is work that cannot be mechanized. You cannot put a machine to take care of a person who is ill or take care of a young child. And so it's only work that in the past used to be done by extended family. The many people used to have this work. We don't have that any longer. So we have a lot of people that are going crazy in home day after day. And this is also something about this, the reorganization of their work that has to be part of this process that I'm talking about.
Nice question back here.
Yeah, it's kind of, you touched on it a little bit. I was just wondering about risk in terms of, because you were saying that reproduction is intrinsic, this idea of kind of exploitation is intrinsic to capitalism and reproduction is intrinsic to capitalism. It's like absolutely essential, so capitalism must be opposed. I was just wondering what kind of risks you see are involved in reproduction outside of the wage relation, and I think you were talking about it a little bit in terms of childcare and so forth, because it seems to me that it's just very risky to try and to do those things. It's fraught with difficulty because of the amount of socialisation and sort of negative stuff that capitalism sort of enmeshes in people through the centrality of that reproduction. It's so intimate. Like something about risk and care. What are those?
I'm not sure I understand, because I'm not suggesting that the building right now of commons, to use this, or like what sometimes we call common inactivities, right? Activities that in a way have a kind of common denominator, the fact that they are performed more collectively, more cooperatively, and that in a way implies that we are rejecting now, for example, or not becoming engaged in a wage struggle, in a classic wage struggle. I'm not suggesting that, right? Obviously. In fact, what I'm suggesting is even to win a wage struggle today, you need to have that kind of common inactivity, right? Because right now, even to win a struggle, in the traditional workplace, right, it's so hard, it's so difficult that unless you go out to the community and you have a community that sustains you, it becomes very difficult, right? We had a case, for instance, recently of the teachers in Chicago. There was an incredible teacher strike in Chicago, and it was a strike not only for money, it was really a strike against this neoliberal agenda that basically wants to tie the employment, wants to tie compensation to the testing, the success of school children in the test. Right? So if the school children fail, then they cut your wage or they lay you off. I mean, imagine, this is what is being proposed in the US, right? And so they were fighting against all that in Chicago, and they won. They really actually had a very good settlement. But it became clear that the reason for the excess was because the organizers, many of the organizers of the strike, and were very rooted in the community. We also had the example of the Occupy movement, where, for example, in California, the Occupy movement gave the power, in a way, to the dock workers. Out of the Occupy in Oakland, there were twice a strike in the Oakland docks, which is incredible, because the docks in Oakland is where most of the merchandise from Asia comes in. So they are very, very important. And yet thousands and thousands of people went from downtown San Francisco to Oakland, and they shut down the port, right? Which is a classical example of how, the connection between a community that is being produced and a new power that the traditional workers have. In New York, in fact, I want to say this, in New York, out of the Occupy movement, has developed a movement of students against student debt, right? Because in the US now, students, the tuition have increased so much that all the students are indebted up to their neck. By the time they leave the university, they are completely indebted. They are servants to the banks for the next 3-4 decades, probably until they have white hair, right? And that's the only kind of debt that you cannot go bankrupt in the United States. So there was all this discussion about struggling against the debt, right? And there was an organization that was trying to take off. And it was able, in fact, to take off because out of the Occupy movement, the Occupy movement, the kind of enthusiasm, the kind of energy, the kind of a sense that, hey, we have some power. There is a community here. And so there is an organization called Strike Debt, now called Strike Debt, which in fact there's a lot more to say about that. And George has been very involved in it, I could say. In fact, maybe, I don't know if you have a copy of the debtors manual.
I'll be speaking here next Thursday.
Okay, you're going to be speaking
About
here. That organization has also produced a very good booklet about student debt, and its position is the student debt is illegitimate, because education should not be a commodity, should not be something that is bought and sold. And so people are right in refusing to pay the debt because it was a debt. But so that relationship, so it's not a question of saying, okay, now we don't fight around wages, or for example, we don't fight to prevent the state from cutting, right, whatever public wealth is still there and further privatize it, right? It's the question of also beginning to organize our own forms of reproduction, and beginning, or at least to think the process and coming together with people in a cooperative form to figure out, what kind of reproduction we want to have, and how we can begin to take initiatives that bring people together, right? For example, how we can begin to understand the politics of the territory in which we live. I don't say neighborhood, I'm saying more territory, because territory is a term that conceives of the neighborhood in a more political sense. What are the cleavages? Where do people meet? What are the problems that people experience, etc., etc. And around this issue, I think new forms of cooperation can be organized. Or at least this is one of the perspective that I think come when we look at the question today of reproduction and how to basically reconstitute some power from below, some power from the ground, which is really the problem we are facing.
I agree. I think it's important. It's just that the problem is it's like how do you reproduce when you're so used to reproducing in a particular way? I mean, it's very similar to the question that guy was asking. It's like, that's why I was saying that there's risks involved.
But the risk is already there because we're already dying.
Yeah, we are. Yeah,
right?
I see.
I'm going to tell you
that.
Yeah.
But it's a fraught terrain. It's just, I think before we rush off and say let's go and cooperate and make a community, there has to be some kind of understanding of sustainability, because those types of ventures, they don't last for a long time. Sometimes they do, but they crash and burn. So it's like, that's what I'm saying, there's this kind of question of care and a question of intimacy and a question of sustainability, and that's what I'm interested in terms of, I agree with what you're saying, but I just think it's before we rush off and go and do it, I think there's some steps we need to take to just slow it down and kind of look at those, but maybe they're more like traditional, women-focused. These questions of care for each other, just very, there's my political things.
Yeah, I think I'm more coming from the perspective that a lot of that is not there. There's not even the risk of losing. It's the fact that you're so. To give an example, right now, it was very interesting what happened with the Occupy movement. Again, I'm sorry if but we had a storm, the Sandy storm. Half of New York, it was incredible. Half of the town became flooded. And part of the well-to-do Manhattan was flooded. And of course, after a week and so on, everything, the water went back, the electricity was restored, etc., etc. There are all kinds of poor neighborhoods, disaster areas where people were in the cold, without food, without anybody reaching there for days, right? And there, the reconstruction probably will never. So, interesting enough, out of the Occupy movement, there are now 20,000 registered volunteers with the Occupy movement, who see their work politically, not as charity, but see their work politically, see their work as community building, right? And see their work and they say so very explicitly, in the spirit that was more typical of workers' organization, for example, at the turn of the century or up even until the 30s. When, for example, unions, at least in the United States, did not only deal with issues relating to factories, offices, but if you had a funeral, they would do some money for the funeral. If a woman remained a widow, they organized the pension system. They had houses or centers where at the end of the workday you could go and talk to other people, and there was a whole transmission of knowledge. The new generation would be, in a sense, recruited into the labor movement, etc., etc. Right? There's a lot of interest now in the U.S. among new generation about what they were doing, what workers were doing in the 20s. They had a kind of power. They represented a certain power. It wasn't a big society. They represented this, and in fact, some are beginning to see the New Deal in a new light. Right? That in fact the New Deal, and when the union become now the partner of the state in the management of labor, right? Slowly, a lot of people who had an experience of organizing the community were lost that ability. Begin to see that in fact there was a kind of counterpower at the community level, because in fact you had organizations, workers' organizations, that didn't deal only with the wage part of the work day, but actually dealt also with the unwaged part of the work day. And therefore they had a presence in the community. I often also make the example of the teacher strike in Oaxaca. There was this incredible phenomenon of a teacher strike who the government attacks the teachers are on strike, the government attacks them, and then you have people from the community, from the state, even from community outside on the hills, coming down and supporting the teachers. And as you know, that became a sort of mini revolution for a long time, right? Where you have the barricades, etc., etc., a whole also organization of reproduction. What happened? Why? Right? I did some work trying to understand who were these teachers, and I discovered that these teachers were a particular type of teachers. They were not just the teachers who went to school and taught and then they went home, and the rest of the day didn't know what the story of the children, the students they had. But they were teachers who were profoundly rooted in those communities, the communities from which their students came, right? That many of the community in Oaxaca, many of the rural communities in Oaxaca and Oaxaca state, for example, the parents in certain months of the year, let's say, I think it was about January, but in certain parts of the year, they go to Guatemala to pick coffee. And so often the children are very much on their own, and the teachers often have a kind of watchdog, extend their work also to all become involved with the children who stay behind. or the teacher is the person to whom people go if they need something, if they have to write a letter, if they have to confront an authority, etc., etc. So those teachers were not just in the school. They were teachers who people related to on a day-to-day basis in many, many other ways. So when they came under attack, the community moved to support them, right? We have suffered so many phases and layers of disaggregation, right? So there's no magic solution. I'm not proposing magic solution, but I'm proposing that we have to confront the kind of disaggregation and powerlessness. There was a lot of discussion in the movements, I think all over, about demands. Should we have demands or we shouldn't have demands? The issue of demands of course are very important. Some demands can divide, some demands can unite, right? But more important than demands as such is also the question of what kind of power, what kind of relationship we can build with each other, right? Obviously, it's not separated from the question of demands, right? But then it has to be very concretely, whom you relate to, what you know of that person, how you work together. And the question of reproduction is a very important place from which to start. It's not the only
I'm going to have
place.
to butt in now because I know that some of these Hydra workers need to go home and
Of
reproduce
course.
themselves. So, to give Silvia a round of applause.